Hello everyone, this is Dr. Catalana. The purpose of this presentation is to introduce Learning Module 5 for EDCI 594. This module is called the Invisible Gifted. I actually started referring to this module as the Invisible Gifted about 3 years ago because I felt that there were so many different groups of students that were definitely gifted, but they seemed invisible. Particularly in the way that we identify students currently for gifted education services. So within the past couple of weeks, we have shifted our focus in the class to start really advocating for gifted students. And the reason I have this random picture of shoes is because I want you this week to imagine what it would be like to walk in the shoes of a child who was gifted but unidentified. In other words, the invisible gifted child. Our case study for this week focuses on a true story. I actually know Jasmine personally, and she went through a very difficult experience while working on her degree in gifted education. For her student teaching, she was placed in a primarily African American school, and this was a Title I elementary school. And 98% of the students received free or reduced lunch. Jasmine was super excited about her placement and could not wait to meet with her teacher and discuss the gifted program. But I want you to really focus on this quote toward the bottom that I've done in red for you. When Jasmine asked the principal about the gifted and talented program, he looked at her and said, "I know you're studying gifted and talented education, but I don't think we have many of these students at our school." This is a true story. This should beyond bother you. And this case study is really building the context for our studies this week. When we're discussing gifted education, we have to make sure we have the right perspective. So I've previously discussed the difference between a deficit perspective, in which we're searching for what's wrong, and a dynamic perspective, in which we are looking for assets and strengths. Unfortunately, oftentimes when I have worked with schools that are in, quote, difficult areas, a lot of the conversation is about closing achievement gaps. This is kind of a deficit perspective. What can we fix? And what I want to challenge us to do is to have a dynamic perspective, to look for what's great and what can we capitalize on. So I apologize for the formatting of this slide, and I've shown you this before, but I want to highlight a few things on this infographic. Mainly is this component right here about the population of students in our gifted and talented programs. 1/4 of gifted students are Hispanic or African American, while 3/4 are white or Asian. We know this does not reflect the population of our students in K-12, so we clearly have an issue. And every single state has an excellence gap. So it's really important that we address these issues of underrepresentation head on. More importantly, you guys are all going to be some form of teacher or educator or administrator. And it's so important to remember that teachers are often the gatekeepers to gifted education programs. Oftentimes it takes that teacher who's got an interest in the student, who has faith in that student, in order to encourage them to actually be identified, right? So we have to have someone cheering these students on. White students, unfortunately, are twice as likely as their African American students to be assigned to a gifted and talented program. And that's even if their students have similar test scores. So we have to admit that there's issues with stereotyping. There's issues with what we, quote, think gifted students are supposed to look like. And if we don't address those, then we just keep up with the status quo. And we can't do that, guys. There are too many problems, and I am just so adamant that we all become advocates for these students. Not all of the gifted students are going to look the same or act the same. We've seen that when we studied our characteristics of gifted learners. So one thing to notice is that we have persistent problems associated with underrepresentation in gifted ed. These can be summarized by what are known as Fraser's 4 A's. So I want to pull this up for you. Your 4 A's are access, assessment, accommodation, and attitude. So first we consider access. How do students enter into the gifted program? We've talked about this. Right now it's all standardized testing. That's an issue. That goes into assessment, which measures are being used. And also we want to think about accommodation. In other words, are our gifted students actually accommodating culturally and linguistically diverse students? And lastly, attitude. So what are the attitude towards students who are culturally and linguistically diverse? The reason I bring this up is we really have to consider all 4 of these A's in order to investigate issues with underrepresentation. If we don't have the right attitude, we're just looking for problems or deficits, that will have a negative impact. If we're using culturally biased assessments, that's an even bigger problem. And if we're not providing services that are culturally responsive, our students won't even want to be identified as gifted. So it's important to keep those 4 A's in mind. One component of your library this week that is super important is the Fraser's Traits, Aptitudes, and Behaviors tool. If you remember back to the characteristics of gifted learners learning module, we did a checklist of gifted children, and I told you I didn't like it. Well, this is the one that I like. And the reason I like this is because Fraser's tab was developed to identify students who do not fit the mold of giftedness. So the tabs represent 10 different characteristics or attributes which are indicative of giftedness. And I want you to think of those attributes as the roots of this tree, and what we look for are the branches. We look for the behaviors that indicate the roots. And the reason I love this is we can look for those observable behaviors and how they may manifest in both positive and negative manners. So I won't go into all detail because this is in your library content, but I wanted to show you an example. Okay, so here's a tree, obviously. At the bottom of the tree, we think about core attributes of giftedness, such as communication, problem-solving ability, and of communication again, apparently. Now, how could we see that in the classroom? So the attribute is the root. How we see it would be the branches. We could see that they adopt new strategies easily. We could also see that students invent and create new designs. They could seem at times too innovative, meaning they're good at breaking the rules. They could have a very advanced vocabulary. And you may also recognize that they're highly expressive with movement and gestures. In the classroom, it would be very easy to recognize these branches, but it's hard to kind of look underneath the ground and see the roots. You may also see a student show off, right? That's actually indicative of both problem solving and some pretty advanced communication skills. It may surprise you. So this is a quick image of what the tabs looks like. You'll see different indicators like motivation and then examples of how they may be manifested in the classroom. And here's your second page. Now, why do I give you that? First off, I want you to start thinking about culturally and linguistically appropriate assessments because that will be important as you become an advocate for these learners. And also, this is a very important tool to help you for the assignment this week. So in addition to your case study about Jasmine that I've already discussed, your assignment this week is called the See Me statement. This assignment is a fun one. It also is a little emotional for me, but basically what you are required to do is to walk in the shoes of a child who's gifted but invisible. So I want you to assume the role of a student who unfortunately may not be identified as gifted. Imagine what it would be like to be that student. What would it feel like? Where would you sit in the classroom? What would you be interested in? And write a letter to your teachers or your administrators to encourage them to see you as gifted and talented. Within this letter, I want you to provide a clear description of who you are, provide some evidence that you are gifted, describe some of the unique challenges you face, and then finally, give some suggestions for how to be supported. Now, I don't want your suggestion to simply be, identify me as gifted. Think about these students who are diverse, who are not represented well in our very stereotypical gifted programs. What needs to be changed? So to summarize, for this week, you have your discussion board post and you have your See Me statement. I want to close this video by reading you an excerpt from a See Me statement from a previous student. My teacher never calls on me since I sit in the back of the room. I'm not really sure she can even pronounce my name, but that's okay with me, as long as I don't have to talk in front of one. I think all the kids in this class freak out about pre-cal, but I'm so bored. I've known this stuff for years, but my teacher back home explained it differently. What's up with all those steps we have to do just to get the obvious answer? I never do well on tests. I know all the answers, but can't tell you how. I just know. Plus, there's the word problems. Those things take forever to figure out. They're all about random things like football, American football. I don't get that game, but seems like I should. So this is written from the perspective of a child who has recently moved to the United States, who is indeed gifted and talented. And it places you in their shoes. That is the goal of this assignment, and that is my goal for this week, that you begin to look at what is it like to be invisible and gifted. Thank you, guys.